The Missouri River still carried the color of autumn silt when Mara Kell buried her husband beneath a cottonwood at the edge of their claim in October of 1884. The service was short. The wind was long. When the last shovel of dirt fell, she stood alone with her 9-year-old daughter, Ruth, and a gray-nosed hound named Skip whose head barely came above the girl's knee. Elijah Kell had died the way most men on the Nebraska bottomland died. Quietly in the middle of harvest from something too small to name. A cough, a fever, a chill that never lifted. He left behind 11 acres of river-bottom soil, a cabin no larger than a corn crib, a half-mended wagon, and $22 folded inside a tin box beneath the bed. 2 days after the burial, his brother, Harlan Kell, rode down from the higher ground and asked Mara to sign a paper. The paper was written in careful hand. It transferred title of the Kell claim to Harlan in exchange for the assumption of Elijah's outstanding debts at the mill and the general store. Harlan explained the arrangement while standing in her doorway. His hat remained on. His boots stayed on the threshold. He spoke gently, the way men often speak when the words themselves are not gentle at all. "You have no man to work it, Mara. A woman alone with a child cannot bring in a crop. Sign, and you keep the cabin through winter. Come spring, we will find you a room in town." Mara looked at the paper. She looked at Ruth, half hidden behind the doorframe. She looked at Skip, who had lowered his head against Harlan's leg without wagging his tail. She did not sign. Harlan waited. When the silence had lasted longer than he expected, he laid the paper on the table beside the tin box, straightened his coat, and told her she had until the first frost to reconsider. Then he rode back up the bluff. The first frost came 11 days later. The morning after the frost, a rider from the county seat delivered a second paper. This one was signed by a judge Mara had never met. It stated that Elijah's debts, when properly totaled, exceeded the appraised value of the improved acreage. The mill claimed the cabin. The general store claimed the wagon. Harlan, having assumed the notes at both establishments, was declared the rightful holder of the deed to the 11 acres. Mara was permitted to keep the unimproved strip along the river. The strip was 17 paces wide at its narrowest and 90 at its widest. It followed the inside of a slow bend in the Missouri for nearly a quarter mile. It was crossed by 2 shallow gullies and covered, from bank to bank, by a thick-standing forest of river reeds tall enough to hide a grown man on horseback. No one had ever tried to farm it. No one had ever tried to live on it. The reeds had killed every seedling that had ever tried to compete for the soil, and the spring floods took whatever the reeds allowed to survive. Mara loaded the wagon with what remained: a cast-iron pot, 2 blankets, a sack of cornmeal, the tin box, Elijah's coat, which was too long for her by the width of a hand, a hatchet with a loose head, Ruth's rag doll, the hound. She drove the wagon down the slope to the river and made camp among the reeds before nightfall. Ruth watched from the back of the wagon while her mother walked a slow circle through the standing stalks. The reeds parted around her and closed behind her. Somewhere in the middle of the strip, Mara stopped and pulled one from the ground. She turned it in her fingers. She looked at the hollow center of the stem. She snapped it in half and looked at the way the fibers held together even after breaking. She stood there for a long time. Above her, the bluff carried the small square of the cabin she had lost, and a thin column of someone else's smoke was already rising from its chimney. Below her, the reeds moved with the river. "Mama," Ruth called from the wagon. "Are we going to live in the reeds?" Mara did not answer immediately. She looked at the stalk in her hand. Then she looked at the wall of stalks behind it, and the wall behind that one, stretching a quarter mile along the bend. "We are going to live inside them," she said. The first night on the strip taught Mara something she had not expected. The reeds did not sleep. Even with no wind moving across the open river, the stalks whispered against each other in a continuous soft rustle that filled the darkness the way rain fills a barrel. Ruth curled beneath the wagon canvas with Skip pressed against her back. Mara sat awake beside a small fire built in a shallow pit she had scraped into the sand. She listened to the reeds. She listened to the water. Somewhere across the bend, a beaver slapped its tail against the current. She did not sleep until nearly dawn. Morning revealed the strip in full daylight for the first time. What had looked at sundown like an impassable thicket now showed itself as something closer to a standing crop. The reeds grew in clumps, each cluster rising from a knot of tangled roots along the wet ground. Between the clumps ran narrow lanes of black soil, some wide enough for a person to walk through, others barely a hand across. Small pools of standing water gathered in the low places. Dragonflies moved above them in slow patterns. Mara walked the strip from end to end before breakfast. She counted her paces. She noted where the ground rose slightly above the flood line. She noted where the reeds grew tallest and thickest. She noted the two gullies and the way the sand had built up in a low ridge on their downstream sides. When she returned to the wagon, Ruth had already built up the fire and set the pot to heat. "We are moving the camp," Mara said. "Farther in." Ruth looked toward the wall of reeds. "How far?" "Until nothing from the bluff can see us." They moved that morning. Skip walked ahead, nose to the ground, cutting a narrow trail through the stalks. The wagon could not follow. The reeds were too thick and the ground too soft for the wheels. Mara unhitched the old mare, loaded what she could on the animal's back, and carried the rest in 2 trips. By afternoon, their camp was set on a small rise of firmer ground near the center of the strip. Reeds surrounded it on every side, so tall that even standing, Mara could not see the bluff above. That evening, a rider appeared at the edge of the strip. Mara heard the horse before she saw it. She stepped to the outer wall of reeds and looked through the stalks. Harlan sat in the saddle at the top of the low bank, looking down into the reed forest. He could not see her. He did not know exactly where she was. He called her name twice. When no answer came, he shouted a third time louder, "Mara, this is nonsense. Come up to the house. There is a bed and a stove and a roof." She said nothing. Ruth, beside her, opened her mouth. Mara laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. Harlan waited several minutes. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the bluff. Above the reeds, the smoke from the cabin chimney continued to rise, steady and thin. That night Mara took Elijah's hatchet and cut her first bundle of reeds. She chose the thickest stalks, the ones as tall as her shoulder and as thick as her smallest finger. She cut them close to the ground with a slow, careful stroke. The blade was dull and the handle loose, but the stems parted cleanly. When she had gathered an armload, she carried them back to the fire and laid them out on the sand. She sat cross-legged beside the bundle. Ruth watched from her blanket. Mara took 2 stalks. She crossed them. She wove a third stalk between them. She wove a fourth. Her fingers were slow at first, then faster. She had learned this once as a girl from a Bohemian woman in St. Joseph who had shown her how to make a basket from marsh grass. 40 years and 1,000 miles from that lesson, Mara's hands still remembered. By the time the fire burned down to coals, a woven square lay across her lap. It was rough. It was uneven. It was no larger than a dinner plate. She held it up against the light of the moon. Skip lifted his head and watched. "Small," Mara said, "but it holds." By the end of the first week, the woven square had grown into a woven panel. It was as tall as Ruth and twice as wide. Mara had learned that the reeds behaved differently depending on when they were cut. The stalks harvested at dawn, still cool with river dew, bent without cracking. Those cut in the afternoon heat splintered under her fingers. She switched entirely to morning cutting. She rose before Ruth, before Skip, before the mist had lifted from the water, and worked with the hatchet until her arms burned. She learned, too, that not every stalk was equal. The tallest reeds along the outer edges of the strip were strong but hollow. The shorter ones growing in the deeper mud carried a firmer core. She began to sort her cuttings into 3 piles. The tallest for the upright ribs of her panels, the medium for the woven weft, the shortest and thickest for the corner posts she was already imagining. Ruth learned alongside her mother. The girl's fingers were smaller and quicker. Within days, she could weave a tighter row than Mara could. She sat beside the fire in the evenings and worked while Skip dozed against her leg. She did not complain about the cold or the wet or the constant small cuts the reed edges left across her hands. When Mara noticed the cuts and reached for a scrap of cloth to bind them, Ruth pulled her hand back. "They stopped bleeding by themselves," the girl said. "I checked." On the 9th day, a second visitor arrived at the edge of the strip. This one did not stay on the bluff. He rode down along the sand of the outer bank until he found the narrow trail Skip had first cut through the reeds. He was an older man, thin, with a beard that reached the second button of his coat. He carried no weapon that Mara could see. He led his horse by the reins rather than riding it into the thicket. Mara stepped out to meet him before he reached the camp. Skip stood beside her without growling, which she took as its own kind of judgment. "Josiah Weems," the man said. He removed his hat. "I run the ferry 3 miles down." Mara nodded but did not speak. "Your brother-in-law came by the landing yesterday. He was asking whether I had seen a woman and a child moving downriver, said he was worried." Mara waited. "I told him I had not." Josiah Weems set his hat back on his head. "That was a true answer. I had not seen you. I have now. And I still have not seen you." He looked past her toward the woven panel that leaned against a reed clump beside the fire. His eyes rested on it for a moment. Then they moved back to Mara's face. "You are making walls." "I am making one wall. To start." He nodded slowly as though he were confirming something he had suspected. "There was a Frenchman up near Bellevue who built a hog shed from woven willow and plaster 20 years ago. It stood through 4 floods. Nobody remembers it now because nobody wants to remember it. Why not? Because he was French, and because it looked like a hog shed." Josiah Weems shrugged. "People forget useful things when the useful thing embarrasses them." He did not stay long. Before he left, he reached into his saddlebag and set a small parcel on the sand at Mara's feet. Salt pork wrapped in oiled paper. He did not mention it. He mounted his horse, turned it back toward the trail, and disappeared through the reeds. That night, Mara added a note to the empty back pages of Elijah's account book, which she had kept from the tin box. The book had once held records of seed prices and mill weights in Elijah's careful hand. From the back moving forward, she began her own record. She wrote in pencil. She wrote small, day 9, panel 4 feet by 6. Weems came, said walls can stand. Salt pork given, not asked. She closed the book. Ruth was already asleep, her rag doll pressed under one arm and Skip's flank rising and falling under the other. Above the reeds, the moon had cleared the bluff. Its light did not reach the camp. The stalks were too thick. Mara sat in that darkness and listened to the river. The first hard rain arrived on the 15th day. It came in the afternoon, driven by a wind out of the southwest, and it fell for 6 hours without pause. Mara and Ruth crouched beneath the wagon canvas, which Mara had stretched between 4 upright reed bundles at the center of the camp. The canvas held for the first 2 hours. In the 3rd hour, water began to pool in a low spot near the center. By the 5th hour, the pool had opened a seam, and the rain was falling directly onto their blankets. Skip pressed himself against Ruth and shivered. Ruth did not complain. Mara watched the water spread across the sand at her feet and understood, with a clarity she had been avoiding, that canvas was not a roof. When the rain stopped near sundown, she walked the camp. The 4 woven panels she had completed leaned against reed clumps in a rough square. Rain had beaded on their outer surface and rolled off. Where the water had struck the woven face at an angle, the reeds had darkened, but the weave itself had not loosened. She ran her hand across one panel from top to bottom. The stalks were damp. The interior spaces between them were dry. She stood a long time looking at that panel. The problem she had been circling for 2 weeks resolved itself in a single thought. She had been weaving panels as though they were fences, flat sheets to be stood on end and lashed together. But the rain had shown her something the reeds themselves had been showing her all along. A single stalk shed water because of its shape. A woven panel shed water because the stalks were layered. What she needed was not a wall of panels. She needed a wall of layered panels, inner and outer, with something between them. That night by the fire, she drew the idea in the sand with a stick. 2 walls standing an arm's width apart. The outer wall woven tight against the wind and rain. The inner wall woven looser for warmth. The space between them packed with dry reed shavings, cattail down, and whatever dead grass she could gather from above the flood line. A roof of the same construction, pitched steeply, so the water would run off before it could find a seam. A floor raised on a platform of tied reed bundles above the wet ground. Ruth studied the drawing. "Like a basket," the girl said, "but you sleep inside it." "Yes." Will it burn? Mara had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she had thought about the rain. Not if we build the hearth right, stone at the base, clay above, the fire kept small, the pipe leading straight up and out through a metal collar. Where do we get metal? I do not know yet. Ruth nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer, and returned to her weaving. The next morning, Mara walked the strip's outer edge until she reached the point where her land met the beginning of the higher ground. There, half buried in silt from an old flood, she found what she had been hopping for, the remains of a steamboat boiler. She had seen it from the wagon on the day they arrived and had marked its position in her memory without knowing why. Steamboats had wrecked all along this stretch of the Missouri for 50 years. Their bones lay scattered through the reeds and sandbars like the bones of some great herd. The boiler was rusted through in most places, but the outer collar, a band of iron nearly as wide as her forearm, was intact. She spent the morning working it free with the hatchet and a length of driftwood used as a pry. When she carried it back to camp, it was heavier than Ruth and shaped almost exactly like the throat of the stove she was already imagining. Josiah Weems returned that afternoon. He looked at the iron collar sitting beside the fire. He looked at the sand drawing, which Mara had preserved beneath a piece of canvas. He looked at the 4 completed panels and the 5th taking shape across Mara's knees. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I have a nephew who works at the tinner's shop in Plattsmouth. He owes me a favor." He rode away before Mara could answer. Josiah Weems returned 4 days later with a length of stovepipe strapped across his saddle. The pipe was second-hand, patched in 2 places with hammered tin, but it was straight and the joints were tight. He set it on the sand beside the iron collar without ceremony. "My nephew says the collar needs a flange to seal against the pipe." He drew it for me. Josiah handed Mara a folded scrap of paper. On it in careful pencil was a sketch of a metal ring with tabs bent at right angles, along with a rough diagram showing how the ring would sit between the collar and the pipe. He said any blacksmith could cut it from a barrel hoop. He said not to try it yourself with a hatchet. Mara studied the sketch. "What does he want for the pipe?" "He wants nothing. I told him it was for a widow. He asked whose widow. I said Elijah Kells. He remembered Elijah from a horse trade 6 years ago. He said Elijah dealt fair. That was enough for him." Mara folded the paper and placed it inside the account book. The pipe changed the pace of everything. With the collar and the pipe accounted for, she could plan the interior of the shelter around a real hearth instead of a hoped-for one. She spent an afternoon walking the strip with Ruth, marking the site of the main structure with lengths of red rag tied to reed clumps. She chose the highest ground at the center of the strip, a rise perhaps 2 feet above the surrounding flood plain, protected on the north by a natural bank of packed sand. The footprint she marked was 12 feet by 16, smaller than the cabin she had lost, larger than the wagon they had been sleeping under. Ruth walked the outline slowly, heel to toe, counting her steps. When she reached the corner where the hearth would sit, she stopped. "Mama, where does Skip sleep?" Mara looked down at the dog, who was watching them both with the calm expectation of an animal who had decided long ago that these 2 humans were his responsibility. "By the door," Mara said, "where he can hear first." Ruth nodded, satisfied. The construction began the next morning. Mara had spent enough nights working through the design in her head that she moved now with a plan that did not require redrawing. She began with the platform. She cut reed bundles as thick as her thigh, bound each one with strips of rawhide traded from a Ponca family camped 2 miles downriver, and laid them side by side across the marked footprint. She raised the whole platform on short cottonwood stumps salvaged from the flood debris at the edge of the strip. The platform sat 18 inches above the sand. Water that came through in a flood would run beneath it, not across it. The corner posts came next. For these she used the thickest reed bundles she could tie, 4 stalks bound around a central cottonwood sapling for rigidity. She sank each post into the sand between the platform stumps and lashed it to the platform frame at 2 points. The posts rose 7 feet above the platform. When all 4 were standing, the structure looked, from a distance, like the beginning of a small ceremonial lodge. She had not thought of that comparison. Ruth said it aloud, and Mara looked at the four posts for a long moment and did not disagree. The wall panels followed. She wove them in place rather than weaving them separately and lifting them into position. This had been another lesson learned from the rain. A panel woven flat and then tilted upright developed weak lines along the seams where it had bent. A panel woven directly onto its posts, growing upward course by course, had no such lines. It was one continuous surface from platform to eave. She wove the outer wall first, tight and close, the stalks laid horizontally between vertical reed ribs spaced a hand's width apart. Then she wove the inner wall, 6 inches inside the outer, looser and more open. Between the two walls, as she rose course by course, she packed the cavity with dry reed shavings, cattail down, and the seed heads of prairie grass Ruth gathered from above the flood line. By the end of the third week, the walls were shoulder high on Mara. Ruth walked the interior perimeter each evening and pressed her small hand against each section. Every panel held. Word of the woven house reached the bluff before the walls reached their full height. Mara had known it would. The reeds hid the camp from casual eyes, but they did not hide the smoke from her cooking fire, and they did not hide the sound of a hatchet at dawn carrying up the slope in still air. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the word would travel, or what shape it would take by the time it returned to her. Ruth was the one who heard it first. She had walked to the ferry landing with Skip to trade a woven mat for a tin of lard. When she came back, she was quiet in the way children are quiet when they are carrying something they do not know how to set down. "Mama," she said finally, "a man at the landing called our house a nest." Mara was lashing a rafter pole to corner post. She did not stop working. "What kind of nest?" he said. "A rat's nest with a chimney." He laughed when he said it, then another man laughed. "Did they see you listening?" "No, Mr. Weems was standing behind me." He did not laugh. Mara tied off the lashing and tested it with both hands. The pole held. A nest is not the worst thing to be called, Ruth. A nest is a place a mother makes when nobody else will make one. Birds do not apologize for their nests. Ruth thought about this. But we are not birds. No, we are better at it than birds. Birds have to start over every spring. The girl smiled for the first time that afternoon and went to gather more cattail down for the wall cavity. 2 days later, Harlan came down into the reeds himself. He did not call from the bluff this time. He walked. He followed the trail Skip had widened over 6 weeks of daily use, and he arrived at the edge of the camp without warning. Skip barked once, sharp, and Mara turned from the wall she was weaving to find her brother-in-law standing at the border of the clearing with his hat in his hand. He looked at the structure for a long time before he spoke. The walls were shoulder high. The four corner posts rose above them. The platform gleamed pale in the afternoon light where Mara had rubbed it with river sand to smooth the reed ends. The stovepipe leaned against a nearby clump, waiting for the roof that would hold it. The whole thing looked, from where Harlan stood, like something between a basket and a boat. "Mara," he said, his voice was careful. "Come home." "I am home." "This is not a home. This is a thing you have made because you are grieving and you are proud and you cannot see past either one. I can see past both. I can see the roof I have not built yet. I can see the winter I have not survived yet. I see them clearly." Harlan turned his hat in his hands. "The talk in town is not kind. I know what the talk is. They are saying you have gone strange, that you have taken Elijah's child down into a swamp to weave her a coffin. Reverend Pike asked me on Sunday whether I intended to intervene. And what did you tell him?" "I told him I had tried." Mara set down the reed she had been holding. She stepped away from the wall and walked toward Harlan until she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "Harlan, you took the cabin. You took the wagon. You took the 11 acres. You did it lawfully and you did it quickly, and I have not asked you for a single thing since. I am not going to ask you now. What I am going to ask you is to leave this strip and to tell Reverend Pike and anyone else who wonders that Mara Kell is not lost. She is simply somewhere they do not care to look." Harlan opened his mouth. He closed it. He set his hat back on his head. Before he turned to go, his eyes traveled once more across the walls, the platform, the stovepipe, the small, careful weave of the panel nearest him. Something moved in his face. Not admiration. Not yet. Something closer to the first uncertain edge of a question he did not want to ask. He walked back through the reeds without speaking again. The roof went up during the last week of November. Mara had spent the preceding days weaving the roof panels flat on the sand, working them larger than the wall panels because the pitch required overlap along every seam. She wove each panel with a double course of reeds, laid at opposing angles, so that water striking the surface would meet a second layer before it could find its way through the first. Ruth helped with the smaller panels. Skip supervised from a patch of sun near the platform. Raising the panels was the hardest work Mara had done since burying her husband. She had built a simple lever from a cottonwood pole and a fulcrum of stacked reed bundles, and with this she could lift one end of a panel to the eave. Ruth guided the other end from below with a forked stick. Once the panel was in place, Mara climbed onto the platform and lashed it to the rafter poles with rawhide strips soaked in river water so they would tighten as they dried. They raised the first panel on a Tuesday. They raised the last one 9 days later. Between those days it rained twice, snowed once, and dropped below freezing every night. Mara worked in Elijah's coat with the sleeves rolled twice. Ruth worked in a shawl Josiah Weem's wife, whom Mara had never met, had sent down with him along with a jar of pickled beets. When the last panel was lashed and the stovepipe was set through its collar, and the flange was sealed with clay from the riverbank, Mara stood inside the finished shelter for the first time. Ruth stood beside her. Skip walked a slow circle around the perimeter and lay down beside the hearthstones without being told. The interior was dim. Light came in only through the small square opening cut into the eastern wall for a window and through the low doorway on the south side. The air smelled of dry reed, of clay, of the faint smoke from the small fire Mara had built to test the draft. The draft was good. The smoke rose straight up the pipe and out through the collar. Mara put her hand flat against the inner wall. The reed was cool but not cold. She held it there for a long moment. "It will hold," she said. Ruth did not answer. The girl had walked to the corner where her sleeping place had been marked with a folded blanket, and she was standing there with her rag doll pressed against her chest, looking up at the woven ceiling above her head. She was crying without sound. Mara had not seen her cry since the burial. Mara crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Ruth, I did not think we would finish it," the girl said. "I did not tell you. I thought we would freeze." Mara pulled her daughter against her shoulder. Skip rose from the hearth and came to press against Ruth's other side. "You worked as though you believed we would finish it," Mara said. "That is the only part that mattered." They slept inside the shelter that night for the first time. Mara had expected to lie awake, listening for weaknesses, for the sound of a stalk giving way or a lashing slipping. Instead, she slept the way she had not slept since October. The reeds around them made their soft, continuous whisper. The fire in the small hearth burned down to coals and held them warm. Skip lay across the doorway, his back against the reed threshold, his ears turning in his sleep at every sound from the river. In the morning, when Mara stepped outside, she found a small parcel on the sand at the edge of the trail. It was wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with twine. Inside were 4 candles, a paper of matches, and a folded note. The note was written in a hand she did not recognize. It said, "For the woman in the reeds, from one who remembers." There was no name. Mara held the note for a long time in the cold morning air. Then she carried the candles inside and set them on the small shelf she had woven above the hearth. The first snow of the winter began that afternoon. The snow fell for 2 days without wind. It settled on the roof panels in an even white blanket that thickened hour by hour until Mara could no longer see the seams beneath it. She had worried about the weight. She had built the pitch steep for exactly this reason, but she had never watched a woven roof carry a full snow load before, and she stepped outside every few hours to look up at the eaves and listen for the sound of a rafter beginning to bend. The rafters did not bend. The panels did not sag. Somewhere around noon of the second day, Mara realized that the snow itself had become part of the roof. It sat on the woven surface as a solid, pale layer, sealing the seams beneath it more thoroughly than the clay chinking she had packed into the gaps. Inside, the shelter was warmer than it had been the day before the snow began. She checked the thermometer she had traded a woven mat for at the ferry landing. The instrument was old and its glass was cracked at the top, but the mercury was intact. Outside, 22 degrees. Inside, near the hearth, 58. Near the far wall, 49. Ruth was reading beside the fire in a shawl and no coat. Mara opened Elijah's account book and wrote her entry for the day in small pencil. Day 62. First real snow. Roof holds, 58 by the fire, 49 at the wall, skip on the doorstone. Ruth reading a book Weems lent her. She closed the book and set it on the shelf beside the candles. The third day brought wind. It came from the northwest, sharp and dry, and it stripped most of the snow off the eastern half of the roof by mid-morning. Mara watched from the doorway as the powder lifted and blew across the reed tops in long white ribbons. She waited for the wind to find a seam. She waited for the sound of a panel loosening. Neither came. The reeds along the outside of the shelter bent with the gust and returned. The stalks were not fighting the wind. They were bending with it and letting it pass. She had chosen the site for exactly this. The natural bank of packed sand on the north side of the rise broke the worst of the wind before it reached the walls. The standing reed forest around the shelter, still uncut, absorbed the rest. What arrived at the woven walls themselves was already a softer version of the storm above. By afternoon, the wind had risen to something the men on the bluff would later call a norther. On the high ground, it stripped the shingles from Harlan's barn roof and drove them across the pasture like playing cards. It cracked a window in the parsonage where Reverend Pike lived. It knocked down a section of fence at the mill and scattered a cord of firewood across the yard. 2 horses broke loose from the livery in town and were not recovered until the following morning. Down in the reeds, Mara added another line to the ledger. Wind hard from the northwest. Reeds bending. Walls quiet. 51 at the wall now, 56 by the fire, Ruth asleep. On the 4th day, Josiah Weems arrived with news and a smoked ham. He walked the trail slowly, watching the roof as he came, and stopped just inside the clearing to look at the shelter from the front. They lost the roof at the schoolhouse, he said. Half of it, anyway, blew clean off during the second night. Reverend Pike is sleeping at the boarding house because his own chimney came down. And the ferry is fine, the landing is fine, my roof is fine, but my roof is old cedar shakes laid heavy and my house sits down in the bend where the wind runs over the top. He looked up at Mara's roof again. Yours sits down here too. I begin to think there is a lesson in that which the men on the bluff have not yet noticed. Mara took the ham. She did not know how to answer him. Weems, she said finally, why do you keep bringing us things? Josiah Weems looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her into the small, dim doorway where Ruth was visible on the floor beside Skip, both of them asleep in the middle of the afternoon in a warm room. Because somebody should have brought them to my wife, he said, 40 years ago, and nobody did. He turned and walked back through the reeds. The great storm came on the second Sunday of January. It began as a light snow before dawn, and by mid-morning it was something else entirely. The wind rose in a single hour from a breeze to a wall. The temperature fell from 20 degrees to 10 below by noon and kept falling. Snow moved sideways across the bottomland in sheets so thick that a man standing at his own barn door could not see the corner of his own barn. On the bluff, Harlan Kell had spent the morning trying to reach the woodpile behind his house. The rope he had strung between the porch and the shed the previous week had broken in the wind, and he was forced to cross the yard by memory, hand over hand along the fence rail. He returned to the house with an armload of wood and a face burned white on one side by the cold. His wife, Eliza, was standing in the kitchen with the youngest child on her hip and a look he had not seen on her before. The chimney is drawing wrong, she said. The smoke is coming back down into the front room, and the north wall is cold to touch, Harlan, cold like ice. He crossed to the wall and laid his hand on the pine boards. She was right. Whatever wind was moving on the outside of the house had found a way inside the framing. He could feel it now, a slow, steady breath of freezing air moving through the wall itself. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature in the front room had dropped to 40. By 4, The fire in the kitchen stove was working at full draft and the room around it was 38. The children had been gathered under 3 quilts on the kitchen floor. Eliza's fingers had gone white at the tips. Harlan stood at the window and looked out into the storm. He could not see the barn. He could not see the fence. He could not see the road. He could see, faintly, a place low in the bottomland where the reeds must be, though the reeds themselves were invisible under snow and wind. He thought about that place for a long time. Then he pulled on Elijah's old buffalo coat, which he had taken from the cabin the same week he had taken the cabin itself, and he told Eliza to gather the children and dress them for outside. "We are going down," he said. "Down where?" "To the reeds." Eliza looked at him. She did not argue. She did not ask what he meant. She had lived in this house for 11 years and she knew when her husband had run out of choices. They left the house together at 4:30 in the afternoon. Harlan led the mare with the 2 youngest children tied to the saddle. Eliza carried the baby against her chest, wrapped in a wool blanket inside her coat. The oldest child, a boy of 7, walked between them holding his mother's skirt. The distance to the reeds was less than a mile. It took them almost 2 hours. Mara heard Skip bark before she heard the voices. She rose from the hearth and went to the door and opened it a hand's width against the wind. Snow drove in around her feet. She could see nothing at first. Then she saw a shape, and behind it another shape, and behind that a horse. She opened the door the rest of the way. Harlan stopped at the threshold. Snow covered his shoulders and the crown of his hat and the fur collar of Elijah's coat, which he had never returned. He did not speak. He could not for a moment. His lips were the color of the sky above the storm. Behind him, Eliza held the baby. The 2 middle children clung to the saddle. The oldest boy stood in the snow beside his father's leg and looked up at Mara with an expression she recognized. It was the same expression Ruth had worn on the day of the burial. Mara stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Harlan came in. Eliza came in. The children came in. The mare Mara led around to the leeward side of the shelter and tied to a reed clump where the wind was broken. Inside the woven house, the thermometer read 54. The fire was small and steady in the clay hearth. Skip stood beside Ruth with his tail low and watchful, but he did not growl. Ruth looked at her cousins. Her cousins looked at her. Nobody spoke. They stayed 3 days. The storm outside did not lift until the morning of the 4th. During those 3 days, Mara's shelter held 8 people, 1 dog, and for the coldest night, a mare that Harlan had led inside through the doorway when the wind rose past anything the leeward side could shelter. The horse stood in the corner opposite the hearth, with steam rising from her flanks and Skip lying calmly a few feet away, as though the 2 animals had reached some private understanding about the situation. The thermometer never fell below 49 inside the walls. Outside, on the second night, it reached 34 below zero. On the bluff, Harlan's house dropped to 12 degrees in the front room before the fire in the kitchen went out entirely. He learned this later, when the storm broke and he walked back up the slope to survey what remained. The barn had lost half its roof. The chicken house had collapsed. The north wall of the main house had cracked along a stud where the wind had worked a knothole into a fissure. The pump was frozen solid. 2 of his cattle had died in the pasture, and a third had wandered into a drift and would be found only in the spring. Every window in the parsonage had blown in. The schoolhouse was gone entirely, taken piece by piece across 3 counties. Down in the reeds, the woven house was exactly as it had been on the morning the storm began. Mara walked its perimeter with Harlan at her side on the 4th day. She showed him the platform, still 18 inches above ground where the meltwater was already beginning to run. She showed him the layered walls. She showed him the pitched roof where the snow had slid off in one great sheet at dawn. She showed him the stovepipe, still seated in its clay-sealed collar, still drawing straight. Harlan did not speak for most of the walk. When they came back to the doorway, he stopped and looked at his brother's coat, which he was still wearing, and then he took it off and held it out to her. "This is yours," he said. "It was always yours." Mara did not take it. "Keep it until spring. You have farther to walk home than I do." He looked at her for a long moment, then he put the coat back on. "The cabin," he said, "the 11 acres, I will sign it back." Do not sign it back. It is yours legally. I will not undo what a judge has written, but when Ruth is grown and if she wants land, I will ask you then. You will not have to ask. He walked back up the bluff with his family that afternoon. Eliza embraced Mara at the doorway before she left, without words, in the way of women who have understood something at the same time and do not need to name it. Word of the storm and of the woven house spread through the county by the end of the month. Reverend Pike came down to the Reeds in February to see it for himself. He walked the interior in silence, laid his hand on the inner wall the way Harlan had done, and asked Mara whether she would consider addressing the congregation on the subject of what a woman alone had built out of what a river gave her. Mara declined. She said the Reeds had done most of the talking already. Josiah Weems came in March with his nephew from Plattsmouth, and the two of them spent a day walking the strip while Mara answered their questions about the platform, the wall cavity, the pitch of the roof, the collar. The nephew took notes on a sheet of butcher paper. Before he left, he asked whether Mara would object to him building something similar on a piece of low ground near the ferry landing. Mara said she would not object. She said she would come and look at it when it was finished, and tell him what he had gotten wrong. Ruth grew up in the woven house. She learned to weave before she learned to write, and she wrote in a careful hand by the time she was 12. Skip lived 9 more years and was buried at the edge of the strip beneath a cottonwood Ruth planted herself. Mara kept the account book until the end of her life. The final entry, written many years later in the same small pencil hand, read only, "The Reeds are still standing. So are we." If you enjoyed this story of quiet resilience and hidden wisdom on the American frontier, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves stories of forgotten women, and subscribe to the channel for more. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We read everyone.